Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Good to see so many faces here, some familiar, some unfamiliar. So welcome to our event tonight. My name is Mario Daniels. I'm a historian at the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam, which is also hosting this event tonight. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce to you our guest tonight, Martin Conway. He's the professor of contemporary European history at Balliol College at Oxford University. He is going to talk about his newest book, his latest research on Western Europe's democratic age. But obviously, he has a longer career and has done a lot of different things. Don't worry, I'm not going into all the details, but you should get at least a rough idea who Martin is. So Martin is an expert, basically, of European history, mainly since the 1930s, but he started his career as basically one of the very few experts, as he also told me earlier today, of Belgian history. His first book is actually on Belgian history. It was called Collaboration in Belgium, Léon de Grael and the Rexist Movement, 1940 to 1944. Which is basically a study on the extreme right movement in Belgium called the Rexist movement during the Second World War. He never really left Belgium behind, so to speak, so he wrote another book a little bit later, published in 2012, The Sorrows of Belgium, Liberation and Political Reconstruction, 1944 to 1947. Starting in Belgium, he developed later on a very broad interest in Catholic politics in Europe and has also published a number of books and articles in this field. For example, one edited volume, edited together with his colleague Tom Buchanan, Political Catholicism in Europe, 1918 to 1965. Oxford University Press, 1996. But ever since, he has broadened his research and looks now at larger topics of European history in the 20th century. I want to pick out two strands. One of them is the topic of today, history of democracy in Europe, but the other one is the history of Europeanization, which we will also treat tomorrow in a workshop with Martin Conway. I look very much forward to learning more on Martin's research on Western Europe's democratic age. The floor is yours, Martin.
Thank you very much, Mario, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, this sort of corner is a corner I've recognized from previous events that I've been involved in Amsterdam, and especially that bookshop. But I've never had the opportunity to be in this space. And I always think of Amsterdam as being an intelligent, debate-filled space. And if I can contribute in any way to that sense of having proper conversations, then it seems to me this will be an evening well spent, and I'm most grateful to those who've made it possible for me to be here tonight. My title is about Certainties of the Past, which was a title I came up with when I was invited, because I thought that what might be quite interesting to talk about is the question that I think is often lurking around elements of public debate in 21st century Europe about whether democracy is over. Not that it's somehow been overthrown, but whether it's waning, whether it's receding, whether there is somehow a loss of democracy in contemporary Europe. And it's clearly possible, if you read newspapers in a pessimistic mood, to think that there is plenty of evidence for that in recent elections in France, in Italy, regimes in Poland and Hungary and so on. You have this sense that actually perhaps something that had formerly been dominant, if not exactly hegemonic, is somehow now much more contested and much more challenged, and in some ways really rather subverted by new political forces. And that's a particular perspective of loss and of uncertainty, which can, I think, easily overwhelm people at present, and a feeling that somehow there has been a loss of the ascendancy of a particular democratic model. And given that my book about Western Europe's democratic age is rooted in a prior era, in the second half of the 20th century, and we no longer live in the 20th century, there's an obvious comparison to make between then and now. The loss is a sense that we still think in terms of a democratic structure and a way of doing democracy, which perhaps is not particularly well adapted to European societies of the 21st century. And in other things I've written recently, I've been, I think, quite forceful in saying that I think that historians in particular have been too slow to leave the 20th century, because the project of writing a history of the 20th century was in many ways the dominant project of the 1970s, 80s and 90s among historians in most of Europe, that actually we've carried on doing that far too long, and that we've been reluctant to enter into the new historical world of the 21st century. So what stems from that is that when people think about democracy, they're looking at the democracy of the 21st century through a certain sort of 20th century perspective, and it doesn't come out well. What people lament is the loss of a certain civic culture, of a certain, what is essentially an intellectual or social hierarchy by which democracy was conducted, in which essentially a rather white, middle-class, middle-aged intellectual cadre had really some sense of control over the parameters of democratic debate that was then conducted in Parliament and the press, and then increasingly, of course, in the late 20th century through the media, be it radio and subsequently television. And there's a certain social hierarchy that lurks behind that definition of democracy of the late 20th century. But also, I think we now see that it was also a geographical hierarchy, a definition of democracy as being essentially about Northern and Western Europe. And of course, we don't live in a Europe that is tilted towards the North and the West anymore. We live in a Europe which is much larger, has much more contested, even violent borders, of course, in eastern Ukraine. But one thinks also of the Syrian war, and we think of the deaths that happen almost every day across the Mediterranean in terms of the frontier between Europe and some sort of North African other. These are very different definitions of Europe that make the sort of definition of democracy in the later 20th century of a Western European democracy seem strangely old-fashioned, indeed, in many ways, just simply over, redundant, disappeared. That sense that somehow democracy had a particular shape at a particular time in places like this and places near here is, I think, one that is quite difficult to escape. And it's strange that democracy now becomes something we think of in a somewhat in a past tense, even when it is the defining feature of Europe in the 21st century. And this sort of language about the democracy we have lost easily becomes a lament for a past era, in a way which perhaps prevents us from seeing the democracy of the present day in proper historical and political terms. The democracy that has emerged in Europe, particularly perhaps in the Netherlands over the last 20 years, is much more rowdy, much more direct, occasionally much more violent, simply at times much more unpleasant in elements of its rhetoric. But historians shouldn't be shocked by these sort of things. 1848 was not a very polite moment in European history. And therefore this idea that actually democracy can be compatible with certain forms of rowdiness or indeed of simple hate speak is, I think, something that we just have to accept as being a reality of the way that democracy is conducted in the 21st century. So I want to talk this evening about the way in which one can look at a democracy of the past, of a particular post-1945 European democratic past, and then try to contrast it or to compare it or to think about it as a tool for thinking about the democracy of more recent times. So, as Mario said, the most recent book I published was this one on Western Europe's democratic age. And the reason why I wrote it was because I thought that there was a lack of historical literature that properly historicised the experience of democracy in modern Europe. I was right when I had that idea. I was wrong by the time I published the book, because I think in the last 10, 15, 20 years there's been a great outpouring of work on democracy across different moments of European history, from the French Revolution onwards. But I still think that there was a need to look at that particular moment after the Second World War, because we have a strong tendency to think that somehow there isn't a need to explain democracy after 1945. After all, what had the war been for? Fought on the side of the Allies, or indeed fought by resistance groups and other combatants through the early 1940s, if not for democracy. And yet, when you go back to the historical record, you find that most people were trying to avoid using the word democracy, and were trying to, indeed, to articulate the idea of democracy. Words like the people or freedom or just liberty were much more powerful in Europe in the mid-1940s, and there are reasons for that, which is that people weren't convinced that the Second World War would somehow open the door to a new era of democracy, and quite a lot of people were rather worried or nervous or apprehensive about the idea that the war might result in democracy. After all, the experience of democracy over previous decades had really been quite negative. If you think about Weimar, if you think about the regime that had preceded the arrival of Mussolini in power, if you think about the ignominious collapse of the Third Republic in France in 1940, you have there several examples of the way in which democracy might not have failed, but was associated with various elements of impotence and of failure, and of opening the door to new forms of populism that, of course, Europeans were very keen to prevent re-emerging in Europe after 1945. So the mood in Europe in 1945 is not one of embracing a new democracy. There was no sense of a springtime of the peoples. I'm often struck that the centenary of 1848 in Europe in 1948 was not really remarked upon, apart from by some communist intellectuals, because that sort of image of barricades and rhetoric and essentially a certain amount of bloodshed that would end in defeat was not the historical reference point that historians, the contemporaries at the time, were keen to revisit. So there's a project after the Second World War almost to create democracy without it being democratic, to create democracy as a method of rule more than an empowerment of the people. And that's why after 1945, in most West European states, you have some sort of project of a new or revised constitution, reforms of political parties, the suppression of certain forms of extreme right politics that had become associated with fascism and with the Third Reich. But you don't really have a sense of making democracy larger. I think in many ways the Weimar Republic was more democratic than the Bonn Republic after 1949, and I think that sense of making things democratic but not too democratic was a very important part of elite thinking, one thinks of General de Gaulle, but also of much wider social attitudes. And the project after 1945 was to create a moderate democracy, a democracy of moderation in terms of political parties, and the creation of electoral and parliamentary systems that incentivized parties to work together across a perceived centre ground of politics, and to avoid that sirens calling people towards the extremes of left or right, which had seemed to be such an important element of the interwar history of democracy and so damaging in the end to the stability of regimes. No, this was going to be a democracy of the centre ground, a democracy of moderation in some sense in all things, and it was assisted, of course, by the kind of long march of socialist politics, non-communist socialist politics, away from a Marxist definition of its purpose, and towards something that perhaps after the event people came to recognise as being what they wanted to call social democracy. And on the centre-right of politics, there were, of course, many corpses of political parties that had essentially expired, but there was a new political force in Christian democracy that had its origins, not least in the Netherlands, in movements of the interwar years, but that became a major political, electoral, intellectual, political force after the Second World War. And that sort of emergence, most dramatically, I suppose, in Austria, but across Europe more generally, of a dichotomy between socialist or social democrat definitions of democracy and Christian democracy, was both an electoral tussle, but also a historic agreement, whereby many of the rules of the game of democracy had already been settled. And it is that ability to lose, not totally, but to lose relatively, which is one of the most interesting elements, I think, of the new democratic culture after 1945. There is a predominant culture of power sharing, which often was literally power sharing within coalitions, but also a sense of power sharing in the sense of people taking turns, and the sense that although you might be out of power at a national level in Italy, you might have your municipal power, you might have your regional power. And of course, this sense also that there weren't just political parties, there were trade unions, there were social organisations, there were farmers' groups, there were women's organisations. And therefore there was an awful lot of not just power sharing in the party political sense, but a more broader sense of the sharing of influence and power and a share in negotiation and the desire to create a moderate democracy that drew people into the room rather than somehow declaring victory and throwing everybody else out. And that becomes an important element of this new politics of moderation, whereby people accepted some sort of rules about power sharing that had formerly not really been very evident in the way in which people thought about it, about democracy. And another element of this moderation of post-war democracy is also a new emotional regime, by which I mean that a certain tradition of noisy, demagogic speechifying, having to shout loudly, partly because there weren't useful things like microphones, but also because it was through shouting that you demonstrated your sincerity and your passion. That disappears after 1945. And you have this strange ascendancy of the ordinary man as politician, or perhaps more honestly, the disguising of politicians as being ordinary men who have to have an allotment, have to have a favourite football team, have to have a family life, and have to locate themselves in a certain culture of being men who understand the experiences of ordinary people. And I say men because it absolutely is true that political life remains dominated by men, but this is also a culture where there is moderation in gendered identities, in the sense that there is actually a presence of women and men in the public sphere, enfranchised for the first time in primitive countries like Belgium after 1945, but also more generally a presence of women in political and social roles in public life, not least through Christian democracy. And that creates a moderating of gendered identities, whereby it is emphatically men who often occupy the principal positions of power, but there is also a presence of women. And this contributes to this change of emotional regime, whereby shouting is no longer the best thing about a politician, and nor is marching, and nor are mass demonstrations. The crowd doesn't disappear out of European politics after 1945, but it becomes a tactic associated with particular political forces, most obviously communism. At times, most obviously during major strikes or crises of decolonization in France, then you get large crowds on the streets for those reasons. But the crowd is rarely accepted as an entirely legitimate partner in the conduct of democracy. Instead, it's a symptom of a breakdown of democratic politics if politics migrates out of doors into the street. So this is a democracy that emerges after 1945 that puts an emphasis not on secret meetings in secret rooms, but on the benefits of having reasoned debate around a table in which the representatives of different political and social organisations might be present, and where agreements can be reached, which may in some sense just be simple compromise fudges that don't solve anything, but they do at least take the passion out of genuine disagreements. Now, if you have that sort of moderate democracy, you clearly don't have rapid or radical social change. And I think another element of this democracy of the post-1945 period is the way in which it's built around a moderate inequality. There clearly is, for the first time, a modern taxation system which gets to grips with taking proportions of money away from the rich. It's only a particular superclass of rich who somehow escape taxation at all. So there is an element of redistribution going on here whereby money is being taken from the rich but not given to the poor, invested in social projects, invested in public housing, invested in infrastructure projects that help to create a benefit for the society as a whole. And that sense of a lessening of the divisions between different social classes is an important element of this moderation of post-war democracy. But note, in particular, especially in comparison with somewhere like America, that class identities remain incredibly durable. And although most of the literature, I think particularly of Dutch novels, is a literature of social mobility, because often the authors are manifestations of that social mobility, the reality of social life is that people's social identity is still defined by their birth, by their upbringing, by their education, and so on. And the degree to which class boundaries become transgressed is only something that happens from the 1960s onwards. So this is a democracy that is also based around a certain sort of moderate inequality, which is reinforced by the way in which the industrial working class actually doesn't have that much power in post-war Western Europe, especially if its power was invested, say, in West Germany, in certain industries such as coal and iron and steel and so on, that are, of course, by the 1960s being closed down quite rapidly on the grounds of some sort of rationalization of an overly heavy industrial economy. So the distance of the industrial working class from power is, I think, a very interesting feature of the post-war era, and instead you have this almost invasive presence, like the arrival of some new plant from the New World, of the middle class, and the extent to which political movements, social movements, bureaucracies, etc., are colonized by what is not the old middle class, but by a much more expanded, technical, educated, skilled middle class that do all the useful things in society. If you're going to build new dams, if you're going to build dikes to keep out the sea, if you're going to build hydroelectric schemes, you've got to have these sort of people to do it. And that's the way in which the middle class and power and expertise become so closely associated in this moderate democracy. So what I'm trying to portray here is a way in which a particular democratic world becomes very influential very quickly, but also unexpectedly. And the greatest divine surprise for those people who in London during the war years in exile had been so worried about the politics that would follow Nazism was that actually the overthrow of political regimes comes largely to an end in Western Europe after 1945. And indeed, West European political leaders can sit back and watch it happen almost in Hungary in 1956 and think that that sort of angry mass contestation of the legitimacy of political power is a thing of the past in Europe. They didn't know that, of course, 2 years later, in many ways, that's exactly what was happening in Paris with the end of the Fourth Republic. But the Fourth Republic's demise doesn't really quite have the same character as previous moments of revolutionary transition in French history, and nor should it. Because although de Gaulle spoke a very big language about being opposed to the model of democracy that had emerged in France after the war, his own version of it was largely a version of a sort of more presidential, more paternalistic model of power, where power lay very predictably with him. And so much of the personnel and way of doing democracy that was present in the Fourth Republic is carried over into the politics of the Fifth Republic. So this doesn't become some grand turning point. So if one begins to look for real challenges to political power in Western European democracies after 1945, you either have to go towards the margins or to go towards Greece or, of course, towards 1968. as this moment when, and 1968 here is a shorthand for probably a decade of contestation, a way in which suddenly democracy is being challenged. Perhaps not always with the greatest serious intent, but also interestingly, almost always in the language of democracy. And that perhaps the greatest medium-term success of the democratic structures that develop in Europe after 1945 is the sense that the only opposition to it can come from democracy, can come through a language of democracy. Not least because, of course, we know that communism in its pro-Soviet, not exactly Stalinist, but perhaps by then Khrushchevian manifestation, was not a cause that was winning large numbers of new votes in Europe. The Italian Communist Party wins votes, but not necessarily through its political agenda, more through social conflict. And that extent to which suddenly democracy is not really being challenged fundamentally by communism, but also, and importantly and historically, it's not being challenged from the right. The failure of anything that you might want to call fascism to re-emerge as an influential political force in Western Europe until the final years of the 20th century is a very interesting historical moment, which again I don't think can be simply explained by the profound discredit thrown on such politics by the antics and the crimes of Hitler and Mussolini. There is a broader element in which people are being brought into the democratic game, and I do think that there is a sense that actually by the early 1960s most Europeans described themselves as Democrats. This comes through in opinion poll testing and so on. And it's a very interesting and often overlooked fact, because people have their partisan loyalties. They're not giving up their loyalty to their own political party that in many areas of Europe they were born into and would die in. But they are thinking of themselves beyond their partisan loyalty as being Democrats and thinking that there's a democratic way of behaving. There's a democratic way of discussing things. There's a democratic way of acting. There's even a democratic way of dressing, and a certain sort of moderation of political language was a very important part of this new democratic culture. And I think that success, if it's a success to be praised, I don't know, that emerges in Europe after the Second World War was what was driving me to write this book, because I wanted to recapture what now seems to be a very particular era of European history, of West European history. People sometimes say when they've been reading the book that when am I going to write volume 2, because it goes up into the early 1970s, and there is a volume 2 that obviously one could write. I don't feel particularly moved to do so, because I think it would be a story not so much of the overthrow of these democratic norms I've just been talking about, but of their challenging, their fraying, their weakening, their relative demise across subsequent decades. And I think that's been the problem that we often have in trying to leave behind the 20th century, because we don't know in Western Europe quite where the story went next. We know about the demise of regimes in the East in 1989. We know about, therefore, about a rather short-lived era of democratic hubris after 1989, but we also know about the wars in Yugoslavia. We also know about the extent to which politics of neoliberalism in many West European states led to a much more contested and polarized culture of industrial relations. And we know also now, of course, the extent to which 9/11 and so on was going to create a new sense of culture wars, of geographical wars, of globalization in 21st century Europe. So we don't really have a narrative about where democracy went next. But I think that if we work at it, we can begin to see that what we have been experiencing over the first 2 decades of the 21st century is not so much, as I started this evening by talking about the demise of democratic values, but about the reworking of democratic values and democratic projects and democratic structures. And I want to emphasize that rather more modest version of what I think is happening, because I think that the language of crisis and of collapse is often very much overdone and is often voiced particularly by people who biologically and intellectually are rooted very much in the politics of the later 20th century. So if we try and take away that sort of perspective of it, of the democratic politics of the 21st century, well, what do we see? there's immediately one word that gets in the literature and gets, I think, in many of our heads, which is populism. Populism is a word which, if you ask students about it, they can all give you a reading list about how it's been defined by various people. And, of course, many of us find it rather inadequate. Is it a movement of the left or of the right or of somewhere else in the political spectrum? Does it have any coherence? How can you link together various political movements that seem to have very little in common, from Berlusconi to the Gilets jaunes or whatever? Well, of course, the answer is you can't. But populism is a nice shorthand for describing new ways of doing politics. First of all, shouting quite a lot, and shouting in quite rude ways, ways that offend against certain norms of democratic debate, not because people simply enjoy shouting in these ways, but because the emotional regime I was describing a few minutes ago seems to me to have changed profoundly towards negative emotions of anger, of hatred, of antipathies, and so on, and a sense of fear and of coming danger that often inhabits European minds in the early 21st century. And of course that simply creates a different mood of democracy. It's not that people are rejecting democracy. What they're doing is they're using democracy to voice a new gamut, a new range, a new spectrum of emotions. They do it by shouting. They do it, to me most trite and obvious, by also doing it through digital means. And the migration of democratic debate from certain columns of newspapers and certain ways of doing things, the old-style public meeting and that sort of thing, manifestos of parties, to a social media sphere where things are much more quick and short and essentially rather brutish, is a very obvious element of the democratic culture of the 21st century, where you can get very sudden, mass, sincere mobilizations behind particular causes, but they can also fade almost as quickly as they have emerged. And I think one question that we will be confronting over the coming months is how far the mass mobilization in democratic clothing behind the war in Ukraine, or in defense of the Ukrainian people, is actually one of those rather short-lived surges of democracy in 21st century Europe, or whether it might actually turn into a way by which democratic cultures in 21st century are rather more profoundly reshaped. Anyway, this migration of the terms of political debate towards a very instant culture of statement and of rebuttal, and indeed of people saying the most appalling things, but only for 24 hours on the internet, is an important element of democracy in the 21st century. It's quite fashionable in Europe, I think, to be snobby about all this and say it's all the work of those awful Americans, and particularly the president before the previous one. But I think that's to accord too much importance to him, and that's why I'm not naming him, because in many ways what's going on in 21st century Europe is very equivalent to that. And I don't think Europeans can give any lessons to Americans about, the resurgence of McCarthyite ideas and so on in America. That's very typical of the way in which political debate is conducted in Europe, and various themes such as anti-Semitism, notably in France, have re-emerged not exactly as legitimate political discourses, but as ones that you can't avoid, because they somehow are part of a political agenda that has reacquired certain themes that had gone very quiet in the immediate period. So it's about a less polite culture, a more direct democracy, one not of intermediaries, and not really one of political parties that often seem to be fighting to maintain their influence because of that other element of all of this 21st century democracy, which is the volatility of the electorate, and the extent in Italy in the last 5-10 years whereby that politics couldn't have happened unless a large majority of Italians have changed their party in elections, probably not once, but twice. That sense of continuity of political loyalty that had been such a steady feature of European politics across the second half of the 20th century has clearly been replaced by a much more sort of beauty contest type immediate reaction to elections. Remember that Meloni had the lowest turnout of any election of the Italian state since 1945. In that respect, You know, people are just not bothering to express a view, but also when they do express a view, they do so in ways that some people can see as far too casual, far too dominated by symbols, by certain sort of marketing devices and so on. This, of course, is a snobby language that doesn't get us very far. What we should focus on instead is that people probably have really quite serious views about the societies they live in, the problems they encounter, but they don't necessarily see voting and certainly don't see political parties as being the best way of articulating that. And instead, they're looking for alternative ways of constructing a political discourse, probably online, but probably also through mass organisations, through campaigning organisations, through issues about the environment and global warming and so on, that seem so much more important than the conventional terms of democratic debate. So when we bemoan the absenteeism and so on of contemporary electoral politics, what we're really failing to notice is the extent to which this has migrated towards alternative spheres. And there is here in all of this clearly the making of a new democratic culture, which is also not really European. And that European word has, I think, become increasingly problematic in recent years. It starts from the evident fact that the EU and the institutions of the EU no longer have the same centrality as they used to have in democratic debate, or indeed in governmental policy making, or indeed in policy making tout court. But it also arises from the sense that actually that European identity, which had very much gone along with the construction of a certain way of doing democracy in Western Europe after 1989, and that was then exported to Central Eastern Europe after 1989, has very much waned and has been replaced by new nationalist, ethnic, exclusivist definitions of we. The sense that we is no longer an inclusive identity, but one that has very much clear borders. You can see in this some really unpleasant xenophobia and about rejections of multicultural society, but it also can be seen in the way in which Brexit referendum became possible, the extent to which other European states have rather carefully avoided holding referendums of that kind, as the Netherlands knows very well, and the extent to which, therefore, there is a reluctance to test the Europeanness of Europeans. And the interesting element here, which I don't think we'll know the answer to for a good while, is how far even the very identity of Europe is declining, that we are past peak Europe, and that we are into different worlds where Europe perhaps means different things in different areas of the continent, but also where in a Europe which is so much larger and so much more fractured, from the Donbass to the Mediterranean, and let's not forget Armenia, Azerbaijan, Syria, and so on, that there is a sense here that actually Europe loses its meaning in this larger panoply, larger cocktail of conflicts that's been going on in the 21st century. So we're now in what might appear to be a kind of post-European democratic politics, which we might bemoan, but let's also remember that that means that the politics that happens in Europe is much less white, that there are spaces for democratic politics to happen among populations who live in Europe, have lived in Europe for a long time, and certainly live numerously in Europe, and bring a lot to European life, who now can find voices that we sometimes think don't actually accord with certain sorts of old democratic norms, particularly of secularism. And there's a culture war element to all of that. But let's not, we can take sides in the culture war, but let's not therefore assume that what we are encountering is a rejection of democracy. It's different definitions of democracy, some of them having origins quite a long way outside the geographical borders of Europe, coming into a really quite direct contact with democratic European ways of doing democracy. It's quite clear that there's no clear end to that process. We can all take part in debates that I was reading one on the plane today in an English intellectual periodical about founding a new democracy. We can all take part in that, and they're all perfectly virtuous in their own way. But I think the main feature that a historian takes away from all of this is the sense that this is an unfinished history, that we have new models or new patterns, perhaps would be a better way of doing democracy, that have been emerging in Europe over the 21st century, that in some sense lie on top of or are in conflict with the definitions of democracy inherited from an earlier era I was describing earlier in my presentation. But the sense that they are actually coming together into something really quite organised is probably still quite absent. And that therefore what we probably need to think about is the way in which we can live through a period of transition, which may well have worse moments to come compared with some bad moments we've already lived through, in terms of the making and unmaking of democratic cultures. But if there's one thing that's a great advantage, of course, of doing history, it is that you know you can't choose. You live in the time you live in. All times are times of transition. That vision that post-1945 was some stable order was something that only really became apparent to Europeans after it was over. They didn't feel they were living in stability. And therefore, this sense that we are living through a period of transition and we cannot choose between the different versions of democracy that are clearly present in Europe at present is, I think, something that makes this period a really rather interesting period and a very good reason for historians to confidently accept that the 20th century is over and that there is a new era for us to study and understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for this really interesting talk. I will open up the floor in a second for questions. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have questions, but I will just hog the questions for a second because I'm sitting here. It's a privilege. So I have one question because I like this idea of thinking about democratic culture along the line of emotional regimes.
Yeah.
And you made this point that democracy after 1945 was relatively moderate, not rowdy, maybe a little bit boring even. So I find that quite interesting because I have actually two questions. One is, where's the rowdiness of the interwar period? So how did it just vanish, right? And then the second thing is, was it maybe not rowdy because it was an elite thing and not a very pluralistic? It was a democratic system, but not very pluralistic. And whenever a democracy becomes more pluralistic, it becomes also more rowdy. Is that something you could describe that way, or is it completely wrong?
Well, of course, the Belgians, as we know, are really rather bad Democrats, but they were quite good at arguing in a rowdy way between Catholic and socialist liberal forces about the future of the king after the Second World War, which produces vast rows, vast demonstrations, mass politics in Belgium in the 1950s. So you can see a way in which, if people get sufficiently passionate about something, yes, they can be as rowdy, as violent as anything of the interwar period. But I think that is perhaps the exception that slightly proves the rule, because that was about a state crisis, about a crisis between a king and a government. And that created a fracture which couldn't be held within the political structures. And what is obvious about the way in which democracy was conducted in most areas of Europe after 1945 was this very careful location of democracy within formal institutions, not just parliaments, but also local councils, social and cooperative economic organizations and so on. And therefore it was always a democracy of representation, where people could get angry and then their delegate, their representative said, well, I will take this to this meeting and we will sort out some solution to this. And that indirect culture was a quite skillful way in many ways of drawing the sting out of politics. Now, there are things that come along, moral and ethical issues, decolonization and so on, that do break through all these issues. One thinks also of the issue of campaigns for nuclear disarmament in the 1950s and 60s. But they are ones that struggle really to bring back the sort of street fighting culture of the 1920s and 30s. Partly, I suspect, because people had seen an awful lot of fighting and the negative memory, not so much of the interwar years, but particularly of what were perceived retrospectively to have been resistance excesses at the liberation, was a way of delegitimizing a certain sort of political violence in 20th century Europe. To which one must add a very mundane fact, which was that the police were much better resourced, much better organized, much better trained than they ever were in interwar Europe. And the ability of the state authorities at some basic level to be able to control a street was a very obvious fact in most elements, in most areas of Europe, of Western Europe in the post-war years. So that creates an intimidation against any idea that somehow you can achieve easy success by shouting loudly, organizing quickly, and of somehow overthrowing power.
Okay, thank you. Let's open the floor. Who would like to ask a question? There's this gentleman here in the first row. No, no, it's fine.
We'll come back to you.
Yeah,
Many thanks for your really very interesting lecture. I have two questions for you. The first question is about the 1960s. You said about the 1960s that the only opposition could come from Democrats or people who called themselves Democrats because the language of democracy was dominant. And actually the same applies to Viktor Orban or like-minded people who talk about illiberal democracy. It's a different type of democracy, but it's the language of democracy to a certain extent. So my question to you is, to what extent do you see a parallel between the 1960s and what happened in the 1960s and what happens now? Or should we regard what happens now as the mirror image of the 1960s? What is the connection between the two? That's my first question. And then my second question is, you've discussed the European Union today, but you have not yet discussed the role of the European communities in the democratic era after 1945. And my question is, what's the role of the European communities, and especially people like Peter Meyer and Wolfgang Streeck and Marco Duranti and Quinn Slobodian all have emphasized the fact that after 1945 the European organizations were a layer of governance to protect specific things against national democracies. And what do you think about that? To what extent do you agree with them?
Well, I'll take that first. Yes, I utterly agree with that. I think that, you know, what is very interesting about the way in which European institutions were constructed in the 1950s, 60s and 70s is that they were creating an opaque layer of governance in which there was certain lobbying possibilities, certainly a politics of representation, but not a politics of democratic debate. And it's very striking, isn't it, how many contentious issues are taken out of the democratic forums of national parliaments and are transferred to a certain level of European governance, not because somebody wanted in some evil way to prevent democratic debate of these issues, but a very strong awareness that these were very difficult issues to solve and that they were probably technical issues, and that if you could create an area of government that was not exactly anti-democratic, but where democratic responsibility was so much more thinly spread, you could actually probably reach conclusions and compromises which politicians might find difficult to defend in a more public sphere to their electorates. And one thinks in this particular respect, I suppose I immediately go in my mind to thinking of the way in which social democrat parties don't defend the industrial workers in traditional industries in many areas of Europe. And that's because they are actually participating, I would nearly said collaborating in, a kind of politics of industrial modernization, which clearly goes against the interests of many of their electors. That's very that makes for a much calmer and probably more reasoned politics of industrial transformation in Europe, but it certainly doesn't add to democracy. Now, that democratic deficit, as it sometimes gets called in Europe, clearly is being moderated by the 1970s. There's very clear attempts to change the European Parliament, of course, into a much more directly elected institution, and to bring a politics of democratic representation into the decision-making of the European Union. But then what happens with Delors and Kohl and Mitterrand is the transformation of the EU into a new version of technocracy associated with the construction of market forces in Europe at the end of the 20th century, which is a sense rather like what I was just describing with heavy industry. It's about the construction of a new regime of legality and of privatization and so on, which I don't think would ever been particularly exposed to the democratic will. And that's a way in which, and I think Europe is still struggling from this, a way in which Europe has become associated with ideas that are the policies that are really simply rather unpopular in 21st century in Europe West and East. Your other question about the legacies of the 1960s is well taken. Yes, you're quite right that, I could have mentioned, I simply overlooked to do so, the extent to which a politics of the populist right in 21st century Europe, be it that of Orban or in Poland, or indeed of Marine Le Pen, less so of her father in France, has some origins here which are quite interestingly ones of democratic rhetoric. And it would be very simplistic to assume that really 1968 was a movement of the left. It was a movement which also rehabilitated all these languages of populism and so on that have become really a major force in 21st century Europe, from Sweden down to Italy, as a way of using democracy against democracy. And that the extent to which that is actually a legacy of 68 could easily be overdone, but I think that there is a continuity there of alternative discourses about democracy in 68. Again, let me emphasize not just the year 68, a continuity of discourses of democracy there, which have had a whole series of political consequences in 21st century Europe. And it's not just the political trajectories of the militants of 68, it's the ideas that emerged out of it, and one thinks particularly of green politics and so on, that have really changed democratic cultures in Europe. Don't ever make me try to write a book or organize a conference of something about the legacy of 1968 in contemporary Europe, because I think that would be almost an infinite task. But I think there is a sense that that set of ideas is still very much part of the European present. Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting talk, and I really enjoyed your analysis of the democracy until the late 1960s being a democracy of moderation, and I lived through it most of the time. I had a question. I had the same question as the second question you were answered, but I have another question. You said that the people of the European Union right now feel less European than they did perhaps a number of years ago. But isn't it true that the European Union has always been a union of the politicians and the technocrats, bureaucrats, and never of the people?
Yes, you put it a little starkly, but...
That's how I had the question.
Yeah. And I wouldn't put it quite in those terms. What I was interested in is a phenomenon that I think historians are still trying to get to grips with, which is about the migration of ordinary Europeans' political and national loyalties towards an embracing of the European dimension at the end of the 20th century. The extent to which blue flags with yellow stars and so on became part, in many areas of Europe, as something that people identified with, not to the exclusion of more local or more national or more regional identities, but as something that sat in collaboration with those identities. Now, I think it's not very controversial to say that in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the extent to which people want to make Europeanness part of their political or ethnic or national identity has declined. And you say it had always the work of the elites. Is that what every Erasmus student thought? You know, there's the simple social revolution of the extent to which people's lives in the late 20th century and then into the 21st century are now lived outside of national boundaries and across national boundaries. But somehow Europe isn't the beneficiary of that. And I can come forward with various explanations, but I would probably emphasize in particular the extent to which the European Union is identified, especially in Central Eastern Europe, with unpopular politics of transformation and economic transformation and political colonization in some respects. I think I would also want to emphasize the degree to which the European Union has become associated with a certain sort of bureaucratic way of doing politics that younger Europeans do not identify with. And therefore there is not some sort of revolt against Europe, but a casual letting go of Europe, and a degree to which, you know, Catalans and Flemish and Scots who might hope to escape from a nation state with which they don't identify, don't particularly think that Europe is a solution to that. It may be a kind of constitutional convenience, but it's not the new loyalty they want to embrace in order to get away from something else. And I think that it's going to be really quite difficult to do something that will put a certain sort of mass cultural Europeanness back in a central position, in a way that I think was true, at least among a broadly defined middle-class youth at the end of the 20th century. But I may here be identifying particularly with a generational attitude. You know, I came from the margins of Europe, from rural Wales. I went to Brussels. I thought I was a European. I was very anti-nationalist. And I'm just washed up.
Thank you very much. I really liked your talk, particularly your analysis of the moderate democracy, which could be seen, I think, as a change in male political culture. But then there is still one big question for me. In the same time, there was a harsh and cruel process of decolonization in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Portugal, later on, France, etc.
Yeah.
And how could you include it within your story?
Yes, well, I'm very conscious of that. I'm very conscious of the extent to which politics of decolonization imposed much greater strains on many of the nation-state structures in post-war Western Europe than almost any other political issue. And that must be true in the Netherlands, and is certainly true in France as well. Two observations. One, that Europeans were very good at turning this into being a story about the success of their democratic project, and the way in which this was actually about granting democracy rather than independence to peoples. This was, of course, in many ways a myth when this independence was being grabbed through violent resistance to European oppression. But the extent to which, certainly in a British context, this is seen as something a bit like the granting of votes to women, you know, which is always described in a very patronizing way, that we will give the vote to women, as if women don't have the right to vote by their birth. And that same element of granting decolonization and the invention of this term decolonization to describe a rather polite process is, I think, something that helps to stabilize the trauma of decolonization and the democratic identity of Europe at the same time. My second reflection on this is perhaps a slightly more bitter one, which is the extent to which the struggles of decolonization were always kept at a distance from the politics of Europe. We think of media management as being something of the present day, but it's something very much present in the era of decolonization. And any of us who actually teach something like the Algerian War in the late 1950s and early 1960s is struck by the absence of any photographic evidence of much of what took place, and the fact you have to fall back on a fictionalized film, The Battle of Algiers, to describe something that was happening on the other side of the Mediterranean. This is a way in which there is really quite a careful distancing of European states from the violence taking place in other lands that tacitly is being thought of as being, well, they're very different over there anyway, aren't they? And therefore, this is something that reflects on them more than it does on us. So in that way, it helped to reinforce a Western, white, democratic identity of European states after the Second World War, because now they weren't imperial states. Spain and Portugal, obviously a bit later than most. They were, in fact, states that lived solely but prosperously on the territory of Europe.
Thank you. I would like to circle back to the question of the EU that was mentioned before, because you kind of talked about the US like this technocratic, bureaucratic institute that is like has issues with democracy. But I just wanted, and you said that like some questions are like technical, and so in that case, it's faster to do it in the form of like institutes like the EU. And I just wanted to ask if you think like claiming that some issues are technical, does that have like an ideology sometimes behind it? Like as long as things go well, people don't necessarily have a problem with having decisions made above their heads, but especially after like the 70s, after the neoliberal turn, the regime changes in Eastern Europe, when these technocratic, technical issues like economic questions or political questions, they were against the will, against the interest of a lot of people. It wasn't the issue that these processes weren't democratic, but that they were simply based on ideologies that were against the interests of many people.
Absolutely, I think you put it very well. You know, the process of governance in post-war Western Europe after 1945, or perhaps more exactly from the 1950s onwards, very much prioritizes the emergence of these domains of technical management that takes them out of a more contested political democratic realm. And I'm not being an apologist for that. I think in many ways it weakens the democratic culture of Europe after 1945. But of course this doesn't happen by accident. It's the sense that actually a lot of these issues about farmers' incomes, about working class lives, about politics of distribution between different regions within nation states and across nation state borders had been incredibly difficult problems for Europe to confront in the 1920s and 30s. And remember that the highest vote for the NSDAP in Germany in 1932 was in farming areas of northern Germany, which had been hit by quite rapid and sudden falls in agricultural prices. These are things that had, you know, if one wants to make an excuse for it, these are things that have very much led to the demise of democracy in the interwar period. And to transfer them into this rather neutered, rather opaque world of European decision-making in the 1950s and 60s was probably, in many people's minds, and remember these are people who are predominantly in their 50s and so on by this point, a way of getting away from the politics that they had grown up with, of angry farmers in the streets and so on. We know that in the end the farmers get angry and they go to Brussels on their tractors and so on, and there is a certain sort of theatre of protest in Brussels. But the process of decision making is one that in many ways is held within new institutions, and thereby creates a more stable democratic culture to discuss other issues. But I absolutely share your view that this is in many ways the invention of a pseudo-technical managerial process of governance that somehow is drawing the sting out of divisive issues, but also drawing the passion and the democratic responsibility out of post-war European life.
Thank you for your beautiful lecture. Maybe I think I do disagree with you about this demise of the European, I think especially the last 2-3 years with the Ukraine war and the Brexit, Trump, I think very surprisingly it makes a comeback. So, but maybe I'm teaching, but I'm teaching in the European Studies department, so maybe that's clouding my judgment.
It's eternally optimistic about it.
That's not my job, but anyway, but that's all. That's all. My question is
fair
actually,
enough, yeah.
My question is a different one. It concerns the relationship between law and democracy. And I still have to read your book, but I'm going to do that tomorrow morning. And, and I was wondering about today, you talked about the new democratic culture, which I think is very interesting. And for instance, the courts play a different role, much more activist and much more polarized. Look at the discussion in Israel, for instance, but also many different other countries. And I was wondering, in your post-war democracy, how does law play a similar role? Was it very different? Or can you reflect a little bit, the very broad question about law and democracy in this transition? Or?
Well, law and democracy go together, don't they, in post-1945 Western Europe, and that's quite interesting. You know, hitherto, law had been seen in some sense as an anti-democratic force. Legal codes get rewritten in many countries, most obviously in Germany after 1945. The emergence of new democratic cultures, such as the Constitutional Court for the Federal Republic, are ways in which law and democracy are being yoked together as part of a kind of common process, in ways that obviously work to intimidate political forces that might be seen as illegal. And here, of course, one thinks of the West European communist parties that are always operating almost on the margins of illegality and getting into trouble in various ways. But also, put it the other way round, this is also about bringing the authority, putting the authority of law behind the conduct of democratic processes, and the extent to which those who might seek to challenge a democratic culture are in some sense also seen as challenging the law. And as, of course, Western Europe becomes more prosperous and more complex in its social organization and so on, there is an ever greater need for law and, alas, also for lawyers. So there's a way in which law is becoming part of the daily experience of Europeans, perhaps not the daily experience, but the ordinary experience of Europeans, because they are property owners, they have all the conflicts and complexities of being citizens within a property-owning democracy. They're therefore drawn into legal processes. And I think this historic convergence between law and between a certain sort of civil law and the practice of democracy after 1945 is one of the ways in which, yes, the culture of democracy changes quite profoundly. And there is, of course, a great deal of thinking about this in terms of legal theorists and the extent to which actually law should not just be a neutral mechanism, but should actually be something that helps to foster cultures of democratic debate and practice and negotiation in European societies. And that's perhaps not the most glamorous or exciting element of democratic culture in late 20th century Western Europe, but it seems to me to be quite an interesting one, and one that, again, if one turns towards the more contested democratic politics of the present, has come under threat as lawyers, as judges get more challenged, but also as the law becomes used much more obviously as a campaigning tool by people who see through law the way of challenging rulers.
Hi, I do have a question about your remark, actually. You said, I'm really moved by your remark that democracy is not in the demise, but rather is a reworking. Mm-hmm. However, I can't seem to grapple with the fact that this invasion of the new middle class that you talked about, and also from a classist point of view, the elites and the upper classes grapple onto power, and also from the other side, that the lower class is also also having a voice to say through this social media activism, this increased political literacy and efficacy, that seems to me, along with the effects of populism and populist media, that whoever gets the biggest podium wins. And this, well, it does occur to me that, well, this simple classist answer that is what gives Karl Marx his fan base back for young people, a lot of young people actually. And my question to you then is that what do you think is holding us back from tearing each other apart on this podium of modern definitions of democracy?
Yes, well, that's a very healthy riposte to elements of what I said this evening. You know, sometimes I find myself saying and writing that the new 1848 is coming. You know, that actually there's so much of a rumble of social and political discontent and of a sense of the new inequality in European societies, which is, you know, it's there to measure in the experience of people in daily life and the fragilization of people's lives and the precariousness of many people's economic viability, that it would be completely complacent to assume that everything will work out for the best. And that's why I was very keen to end this evening by saying that we don't know how this story is going to end. I think what has perhaps led me away from saying that too emphatically this evening is that I've been very struck by the way in which sort of fears of a new sort of populist march on power in France or Italy or elsewhere in Europe have actually been rather disproved over the last 2 years by not suddenly the populists turning out to be nice people after all, but by the extent to which they have been drawn into the politics of a certain sort of new democratic game that makes the anti-regime strength of their movements really dissipate on contact with power. But the social realities of anger and of marginalization that one saw with things like the Gilets jaunes movement is absolutely there. And that might be where the new 1848 is going to come from. I certainly don't have some complacent belief that the current combination of, say, Scholz and Macron has a solution to providing a political stability for Europe in the coming years. I mean, I think that there's got to be some change of political class, some change of political generation and change of democratic culture. Whether that can happen within the existing structures or whether it has to be, as you're perhaps suggesting, through a more contested politics of the street, I'll wait to see.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Three hopefully very short questions. Maybe the answers are going to be long, but I was intrigued by your statement that the Weimar Republic might have been more democratic than the West Germany. Second question, you said that one of the reasons why after the post-World War II, the police was better resourced and better trained than it is than prior to the Second World War. And if you look at, for instance, the UK right now, where in the United States, with defund the police and all that, how do you see that in context, historical context? And is there something to be said of movements going on? And the last question, which is actually a follow-on question about law and democracy, what you're seeing, for instance, in the Netherlands is the Urgenda court case. I don't know if you know about it, where it seems that the courts are becoming more important than possibly the elections, because you can take governments to court. You don't need a lot of people to do that. You know, just a couple of funders and some lawyers. How do you see that developing in the future? And is that a threat to democracy, possibly, or not? Thank you.
Not a threat to democracy. I mean, it's more part of this reworking of democratic culture, isn't it? And both your questions on law have made me aware how far I'd kind of bracketed out the degree to which part of this new democratic culture is the instrumentalization of the institutions and rhetoric of law to serve new political purposes. I'm going to sound complacent by saying that in many ways this is actually opening up new avenues for people to feel as though their ideas are being represented in the public sphere. Somehow into my head wanders also the extent to which a certain sort of celebrity culture that we always want to deplore is another way by which quite a lot of people actually somehow get involved in public debate. And I mean, those dramas about celebrities are often played out through law courts, aren't they? So I suppose there's that sense that I think that there's a kind of broader definition of legal process going on here, which might actually be rather good for democracy. The police. Yeah, I mean, I do believe that, you know, there's quite a revolution in policing in Western Europe after 1945, and that results in much more policed societies. I don't think that's necessarily a very good thing at all. The extremes of that were the troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 70s, where you were deploying not just police but army in very repressive mode, and with an absence of democratic accountability, which is still evident in the inability to bring to trial any of the people who were responsible for deaths in that period. But that period when somehow the police could be above criticism has clearly gone. It is collapsed in Belgium during the Dutroux affair in the 1990s and has now collapsed across a lot of Europe. And I think that challenging of the authority of institutions such as the police is clearly part of this new, more rowdy 21st century culture. And I think if police forces think they are going to recover their reputation in some straightforward way, I don't think that's at all going to happen. But if they will actually rethink what policing is in various ways, then perhaps they can actually restore a certain legitimacy that they have undoubtedly lost in certain major cities in dealing with certain populations. Weimar, well, that was a casual comment. You know, I dislike any teleology, and that sense that somehow Europe has been getting more democratic across the 20th century seems to me to be really very simplistic when one actually looks at the very volatile, noisy, rather chaotic democratic politics of the Weimar Republic, which could have ended up in 101 different directions. It happened to end up in the most awful one, in the victory of the NSDAP and so on. But that clearly was not inevitable, and therefore there was a sense that Weimar was a trial run for a much more inclusive German democratic practice of politics. And what happens in West Germany after 1949, for reasons one can very much understand, but particularly due to the kind of semi-sovereignty of West Germany at that point, is a much more managed and under surveillance form of democracy, with the constitutional court, with the construction of very specific political parties that received allied approval for their operations. And that seems to me to cut out a much broader swathe of German society from having an active role in democratic politics. Their role was a politics of representation through Catholic organizations, through socialist trade unions and the like. And that's what I meant by a sense of a democratic retreat in Germany after 1949.
Well, thank you for your talk. Hi, hello there.
There you are.
As a historian of the 21st century, I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this new democratic culture. And you chose to use the word populism to describe that, a word which you said yourself is, or a concept, very elusive, very difficult to define. Did you have any other candidates?
Well, obviously, I'm trying to choose there a word which is just nice and easy, but also avoids the very negative connotations that one associates with certain sort of languages like neo-fascism and so on. And I think that in common with most historians, I don't find the use of the F word to describe most political forces in 21st century Europe very useful. But I feel always a certain sort of moral doubt in my head when I do that. Because am I somehow rehabilitating forms of politics when I don't use the word fascism to describe them? Because obviously in many ways, some of the political movements in 21st century Europe almost outdo certain forms of interwar fascism in terms of their rhetoric and the reality of their actions. But no, I don't want to go there, because I think it also excludes from our consideration not so much a politics of the left that one might associate with people like Mélenchon, but also excludes the much wider diversity of sub-political social protest and anger that I understand is a very legitimate presence in the unequal society of the present day. And populism is just a kind of convenient way of wrapping that all up in a single term, while assuming that the incoherences and conflicts within that term will become much more evident over the years to come, even if they're not entirely evident to us today. I think at the most basic, rather flippant level, I just want to see who becomes the next president of France. You know, when you have an election where Macron is not the establishment candidate, you know, what is going to happen there? You know, and I think, you know, it's indecent to say it, but it's kind of quite exciting to think about how a sort of, you know, different versions of populist politics are going to compete across that electoral spectrum in the election, especially if they retain the structures of the Fifth Republic with a winner-takes-all presidential system. But
thank you. Like many others, I've been particularly intrigued by your description of this transition from one, I think you said, emotional regime in terms of democratic cultures, especially in the post-war period. And I have a very, or rather practical question. I couldn't help notice that, or imagine, especially men
yes.
In these cultures, and I think it was said before, sort of dressing themselves in moderation and rationality, and affirming what I think Eva Luz has described as a sort of emotional hierarchy between masculine rationality and feminine emotions. So I'm looking for some practical advice.
Oh dear.
How do we get out of this sort of political culture? You called for less politeness and more shouting, but I'm also wondering how is a woman supposed to shout without getting denounced as feminine, emotional, and if worse comes to worse, hysterical?
Yes. Well, I'm glad you spotted my gendering of post-1945 democratic cultures as being the invention in many ways of new forms of male political citizenship, which is something I'm writing about at the moment and that might even be a next book. And I think there's something very interesting to say about the way in which being a male citizen in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe after 1945 goes through some really quite profound changes and cycles of militancy, but also cycles of really quite much more polite participation in democratic cultures. But as we all know, men in the end are really quite an unmanageable force in 20th and 21st century politics. And I think since perhaps the mass demonstrations of 1989, but particularly over the last 10 years, you've seen the re-emergence of a kind of misogynistic machismo type form of male politics that I don't think means that all men are trying to oppress women, but it's about the re-legitimation of discourses of male authority, gendered authority, with which I would profoundly disagree. And this really creates a new social issue in 21st century Europe. Journalists talk about toxic masculinity. And clearly your question to me is entirely the right one about how we actually construct a female presence in this much more volatile, noisy democratic politics that is emerging. It's no longer a second wave feminist issue about acquiring rights and presence and visibility and indeed representation. It's about how you construct a female politics of assertion and of demanding more, in a more activist way, a fair deal for women in European society. And I think of that particularly in the wake of Roe v. Wade and so on in America, and the extent to which women's bodily autonomy might be under threat in 21st century Europe. But I also think of it in a rather different tone about the presence of women within campaigning organisations, trade unions and so on, where I think, I don't know what you would think about this, but I think that there's probably been quite a generational shift over the last 10 or 20 years towards women becoming a much more influential presence, not so much in politics with a capital P, but in those sort of organisations. And that perhaps provides something of an answer to your question about how actually women can impose their emotional regime on 21st century politics without being drowned out by the unpleasant politics of a certain sort of uncontrollable male anger, which I also want to just historicise and say, you know, this arises out of the fact that actually a lot of male lives are actually really ones that have been quite damaged and rendered quite difficult over the last generations or so. And that's probably helping to understand some of the forms of, well, essentially almost criminal behaviour that one's seen in recent years, but I'm not seeking to somehow excuse those by historicising them.
Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture. My question is also about the emotional regime.
Okay.
So I was reading articles about the nature of emotions, whether it's by nature or by nurture. So what do you think in the history of 20th century, do you think is there a convergence of or change in the nature of emotions in democratic Europe? And do you think is emotion or emotive driving the regimes, or the regimes are driving the emotions or emotive? Yeah, basically, do you think, what do you think is the nature of emotion?
Well, historians never hesitate really to go towards arguments about how emotions are made by material circumstances, by social structures, by upbringings, by different almost generational cohorts of psychological formation, and therefore I would always retreat from anything that emphasized some sort of essential making of emotion in some sort of almost separate sphere. What one sees is about the working out of emotions through people's socialization, adolescence, young adulthood, that then set the tone for the tone of their political engagement if they become politically engaged. And I think that what we have seen over the last 20 or 30 years is clearly a shift of emotional regimes away from dreams of the future we might all one day have, to fears of the future that we dread may actually come to pass. And that changes, I think, quite a lot of the emotional formation of younger people in European society. I don't want to get too gloomy here, but I think it's quite difficult to find resources of optimism for people of those generations. And I think it's inherent in what I just said that I don't really think that regimes, governments, politicians have much control over these forces. They may try to ride upon them, they may try to surf upon them in particular contexts, and one sees that again in various populist movements. But I think that really what is happening in Europe is about the way in which, and perhaps the COVID epidemic added to this, the extent to which we are actually living through quite a difficult period in terms of people being able to find expression to their emotions, which is not, for example, oppressive of women or racist. And I think that we need to understand how we're going to bring that sort of emotional drama that people often experience in their lives within the sort of conduct of 21st century society that we would like to bring about. I could talk all night on that, but probably not to anybody's great education. You know, I mean, there are issues about education, about social welfare, and so on. Yeah? Marginalisation, and so on.
Yeah, indeed, I have bad news. We are out of time. So let's thank Martin for this talk. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you for your question.